It wanted to rain, and John was tired, but he still had 6 more rows to go with the cedar. What? Sorry. Okay, whatever. This is not lights out, like I said. Not a typo. But he still had 6 more rows to go with the cedar before he was done, and it had to go back tomorrow without fail. So he unfolded the accordion top on the tractor and drove on. It had been a good week, all things considered, especially compared to the week previous. A large military transport passed overhead on its way to the airport in Gainesville. Won't be many more of them, I think, he said to himself. With the rail lines coming back into play, sure got us out from between a rock and a hard place, though. The rain began to come down steadily as he finished the last 2 rows. When the truck came by to pick up Ann in the morning, they'd be taking the implement with them. He smiled when he thought about that. It had taken a little while for him to get used to the idea, but he had to admit she'd been very foresightful when she cut her deal with the university. The surprise that she didn't get to tell him about until the next day after Carla's letter had come in had been the fact that the university wanted her to come back to work right away, badly enough that they'd feed and lodge her to get her to do so. With the economic and physical devastation caused by the asteroid impact and its resulting weather effects, local food production and self-reliance suddenly took on an importance that they had not enjoyed in many decades, maybe ever before. With her Atlantic ports smashed, her Gulf ports damaged to one degree or another, and acute fuel shortages predicted to last several years or more, the governor made it a crash priority that Florida had to become more self-reliant in food production. This pointed the arrow of urgency straight at the various state colleges of agriculture and the state cooperative extension service that presented their public face. After years of slowly subsiding in political and budgetary relevancy, this sudden urgency and importance had taken them utterly unawares, and they were now scrambling to fulfill what they had been tasked to do. Now, like never before, the vast collection of knowledge held in their libraries and databases on large and small-scale food production, food preservation, home economics, disaster mitigation, and other topics needed to be able to get out to the people. This meant the university needed its trained staff to find and distribute this information, much of which had been previously considered outdated, which meant they needed Anne and her colleagues. John backed the tractor under the barn overhang so he could detach the grain drill and clean it, so he could return it like he'd received it. It was an old drill. The extension farm off campus no longer used it, as they had newer, more efficient equipment, but for planting oats and wheat like he'd been doing, it worked well, and it would fit his tractor. Realizing that she had an importance that she'd never held before, Anne had dickered with the vice president that part of her salary was to be paid in ways such as allowing her to borrow certain tractor implements or other agricultural machinery that would be useful on the Horn farm, becoming one in actual fact rather than just a fanciful name, as well as necessary seed and other considerations. The VP took it all in stride, but insisted that she work with the university agronomists on certain projects, which is how John came to be planting this new variety of hull-less oats rather than the oats he'd intended to plant it, and also putting in several acres of soft wheat to be trialed. This was fine by him, as they would get to keep half of the grain, and the agronomists would get their data and seed to distribute if it worked out. He'd also agreed to greatly increase his planting next spring in the open-pollinated yellow dent corn he'd been conserving and improving on his own for the last 7 years, which he'd intended to do anyways, but now they wanted to study it for possible distribution as well. All of this grain planting left him short of pasture, which he solved by getting Ed to agree to rent him an adjoining pasture, which he had no present use for, having sold so many of his cattle to the Recovery Command. It was going to be a long winter, and they weren't out of the woods yet, but if they could make it through, then next summer they ought to be doing all right relative to quite a lot of the rest of the surviving state population. At least they could grow their own food. You couldn't get fuel at all if you didn't have a ration priority, and very little even if you did, but he hoped that would change in the coming months. All of this unexpected planting would have more than completely used up his stored diesel fuel. But agricultural food production now enjoyed a ration priority just below food transport and emergency services, so it had been possible to get enough for the plowing and planting. There wasn't any gasoline to be had, not even for himself as a sector deputy or Lisa as one of the most important personnel at the clinic in Archer. Well, where was he going to go anyways? At least the university picked up Anne and brought her home again. They couldn't pick up and drop her off every day, which meant that she stayed in the dorm during the week and was only home for the weekend. Even after only a week, he missed her when she was gone, most especially with 3 girls in the house and Lisa being at the clinic all day. With the cedar ready to be picked up, he put his slicker and hat on and walked over to Mike's place. He should be getting home about now and was supposed to have the case wrap up on the Tearsdale murder, which he'd have to review and sign off on. He was still dreaming about it. I'll never get used to that. My God, I hope I never get used to it, he sighed to himself as he squelched down the road. After the riot and breakout at the camp had been resolved and the sheriff's office could get around to lesser priorities, they had identified the perpetrator. His name had been Richard Lewis Nelson, with a long history of mostly minor crimes, but his last conviction had been for attempted rape. In fact, he was supposed to be still in jail for the crime, but it turned out that in the previous week, the local prisons had been forced to release a number of prisoners on early parole because the increasing absenteeism of the prison guards and the lack of food to feed the prisoners was making it impossible to guard all but the worst offenders. Too bad he had to rape and murder a woman and nearly do the same to her daughter for them to find out that they'd made a mistake with that one. Well, he'd murder no more. He'd felt guilt pangs for shooting the rustlers, but not for killing Nelson. It's too damn bad somebody else didn't do it before he reached the Tearsdales. The Sunday of the dog hunt, murder, and camp riot seemed a month long to him. They'd been at Shands until nearly 4 a.m. in the morning before the word had come that fresh troops from the recovery HQ at Camp Blanding and the on-site troops and law enforcement had finally managed to crush the rioting, but at a heavy cost of 127 civilians killed, 13 soldiers, 4 deputies, and police officers. The ringleaders of the riots had been identified, were tried, and subsequently ordered shot by the new county recovery commanding officer, a Major Randolph McCall. After much intense negotiation between the Recovery Command, the governor's office, and a coalition of county boards of commissioners and sheriffs, it was agreed the camps and the coastal areas directly devastated by the tsunamis would be placed under direct federal administration, or DFA for short. DFA, okay, get that one. Yep, that fits it. Which so far, as John could tell, seemed to be a euphemism for martial law without actually coming out and calling it that. All areas outside of these zones would remain under what civil law there remained. Word around the department was that it was the arrival of the first military transport planes carrying food relief that actually ended the riots. Once word got around what was in the planes that flew over Gainesville, the rioters simply gave up. John didn't care either way if it meant they weren't going to have to participate in a pitched battle.